They weren't prepared for what they were about to see. Not truly. You can train yourself to expect disorder. You can brace for clutter, for dust, for the general residue of a long human life packed into cardboard and forgotten corners. But nothing quite readies you for the precise, suffocating weight of a room that was never meant to be opened. Not by you, not by anyone. And yet here they were, a team of workers, moving specialists, and estate staff stepping across the threshold of rooms inside one of Britain's most recognizable private residences, and feeling almost immediately that they had walked into something they were never supposed to witness. The numbers alone should have been enough of a warning. Over 30 bedrooms, more than 70 individual rooms in total, spread across a property so vast that sections of it hadn't been routinely accessed in years. In one wing, carpets still bore the impressions of furniture that had been removed days prior, ghostly rectangular outlines pressed into the pile like evidence. In another section, wallpaper had peeled back at the corners to reveal older layers beneath, each one a different era, a different version of the life conducted here, all stacked on top of each other like sediment. And then there were the rooms that had simply been left, not emptied, not cleared, left. Items stacked against walls as though someone had stepped out for an afternoon and not returned. Objects wrapped in cloth that no one had thought to unwrap, or perhaps no one had dared. One worker, speaking privately to a journalist later, described the sensation not as entering a home being vacated, but as entering a home that had been frozen, sealed, preserved, and now finally cracked open. Was this a residence, a storage facility, a private archive of a life deliberately kept out of reach? The answer, it turned out, depended entirely on which room you were standing in, and some of those rooms contained things that would reframe everything that came before them. The official account of the Royal Lodge transition was clean, measured, and conspicuously vague. A private relocation, personal effects being managed in the customary fashion. A man stepping back from one chapter of his life and moving quietly into the next. That was the version constructed for public consumption, and it was delivered with the kind of smooth institutional composure that the royal apparatus has refined over centuries. The reality, documented in fragments by removal crews, estate surveyors, and individuals connected to the household, looked considerably different. When the full inventory process began in earnest, prompted not by voluntary disclosure, but by the practical necessity of vacating a property that the Crown Estate had been applying sustained pressure to recover. What emerged from those rooms was not simply a collection of personal belongings awaiting removal. It was a curated, layered, and in some cases inexplicable accumulation of objects, paperwork, and material that spoke to decades of a life lived under the assumption that no external accounting would ever be required. Among the items cataloged were artworks, not the kind acquired casually, but pieces that specialists who were later consulted described as significant in both monetary and provenance terms. Several were identified as gifts from individuals whose names, once spoken aloud in this context, arrived carrying considerable weight. The question that immediately followed was not their value. It was their origin, and more pointedly, why they remained unregistered, undisclosed, and in a private residence rather than handled through the proper channels that govern the acquisition and management of items of this nature within the royal framework. There were also documents. The specific nature of their contents has not been fully disclosed, and that lack of disclosure is itself a detail worth holding onto. What has been confirmed by those with knowledge of the inventory process is that certain correspondence and records were identified as requiring separate handling, removed not with the general household effects, but under distinct arrangements. Specialists who were not part of the original removal team were brought in for this particular task. That decision, to separate, to segregate, to treat certain materials as categorically different from the rest, was made by someone, for reasons that have not been publicly explained. Gander & White, the specialist fine art and high-value transport firm whose vehicles were observed at the property on multiple occasions, were engaged not for a straightforward house move, but for something more selective. Sources familiar with their work noted that their involvement signals the presence of items that require more than careful handling. They require legal and insurance documentation, climate management, and a chain of custody. The firm doesn't collect boxes. It collects things that someone somewhere has already determined cannot be treated as ordinary. But it was one particular room, described in detail by two separate individuals with knowledge of the estate, that crystallized the significance of everything else. A room on the upper floor, accessed through a corridor that led away from the main residential quarters, which had been kept locked throughout the final years of occupation. When it was opened, the contents weren't dramatic in any cinematic sense. There was no single explosive object, no cache of documents bound with ribbon. What was there instead was quieter, and in its quietness, far more unsettling. A room organized with such deliberate, methodical care that its contents could only have been arranged, curated, and maintained by someone who fully intended them to stay hidden. Someone who had simply never imagined the day would come when that room would no longer be theirs to control. Step back from the individual rooms. Step back from the objects and the documents and the questions they generate, and look at the building itself, what it was, what it had become, and what it looked like in the days and weeks following Andrew's departure. Royal Lodge is not a modest property that grew beyond its means. It is a 30-room grade II-listed residence set within Windsor Great Park, a home that was once occupied by the Queen Mother, that carries within its walls the full architectural and emotional weight of the institution it has always served. The grounds alone span hundreds of acres. The interior, even in a state of partial vacancy, retains the kind of presence that cannot be replicated by renovation or decoration elsewhere. It is a place designed, in every physical dimension, for a life conducted at a certain scale, and that scale was now being audited. What the vacating process made plainly visible was the sheer accumulated mass of a royal life that had never previously encountered meaningful constraint. Furniture too large for any room at Marsh Farm. Collections of art, of memorabilia, of objects gathered over decades of international travel and ceremonial function that had been arranged, displayed, and tended to within a space purpose-built to accommodate them, and which now faced the mathematical reality of a 5-bedroom farmhouse. The decisions required were not logistical, they were existential. What do you discard when everything you own has been a physical expression of who you are? The teddy bear collection, reported across multiple outlets, had numbered 72. 72 individually acquired, individually placed, individually significant objects that had occupied space on shelves, in display cases, in rooms designed with their presence in mind. The collection wasn't incidental. Collections of that size and duration are never incidental. They are statements of continuity, of permanence, of a self that persists and accumulates. The number that reportedly made the journey to Marsh Farm was 1. The arithmetic of that reduction, 72 to 1, is not about teddy bears. It is about the collapse of an entire framework of self-perception. Insiders who spoke to journalists covering the transition described Andrew's state during this period not in terms of stress or logistics fatigue, but in terms that pointed towards something considerably more destabilizing. One account described a man who moved through the vacating process with an air that oscillated between stubborn disbelief and something approaching genuine shock, as though, even at the point of physically removing his belongings, some part of him had not fully processed that this was irreversible. He was not, by these accounts, dismantling a home. He was being separated, incrementally and without ceremony, from the physical infrastructure of an identity he had spent 60 years constructing. And the lodge, as it was cataloged and handed back, stood as the most tangible evidence of what that infrastructure had actually looked like. Here is where the narrative demands more than description. Here is where the question stops being what was found and becomes something harder and more consequential. Why was it there at all? Consider the premise carefully. This is not a private individual who accumulated sensitive materials through oversight or carelessness. This is a man who has been at the center of one of the most scrutinized public scandals in modern British history. For years, and specifically since the events that culminated in his 2019 BBC interview and the subsequent withdrawal of his royal duties, Andrew has existed under a level of public and institutional observation that most people cannot fully imagine. His associations, his communications, his finances, his movements, all of it has been the subject of legal proceedings, journalistic investigation, and sustained parliamentary and public pressure. Against that backdrop, the question of how certain materials remained inside Royal Lodge, unaddressed, for so long becomes genuinely difficult to answer through the ordinary frameworks of negligence or oversight. The connection to Jeffrey Epstein is not incidental background context. It is the architectural fact around which everything else in this story is organized. The civil settlement reached with Virginia Giuffre in 2022, which arrived without admission of liability, but with a financial arrangement whose reported scale communicated its own message, did not represent a conclusion. It represented a pause. Legal settlements of that kind do not erase the underlying record. They remove one venue for examination. The documents, the correspondence, the material evidence of a relationship that was maintained for years beyond what Andrew publicly admitted to. These things exist in multiple forms, in multiple locations, under the custody of multiple parties. The question that the Royal Lodge inventory raises, quietly but insistently, is whether some of that material had a home address. Art appraisers who reviewed images of items visible during the removal process, images that circulated through channels before any formal account was issued, identified at least two pieces as consistent with works known to have passed through the possession of individuals whose names appear prominently in documents related to the Epstein network. That identification was not published by a mainstream outlet under headline terms. It appeared in specialist coverage, in legal observation blogs, in the kind of constrained, careful language that experienced journalists use when they are certain of something they cannot yet fully prove. The restraint of the language does not diminish the substance of what was being said. Former household staff, several of whom spoke to journalists under conditions of anonymity, described a pattern of compartmentalization that was understood within the domestic structure of the lodge as simply the way things were. Certain rooms were not discussed. Certain visitors arrived and departed without formal record. Certain arrangements for deliveries, for the handling of packages, for the management of correspondence, operated through channels that bypassed the ordinary administrative infrastructure of the household. None of these accounts, taken alone, constitute proof of anything. Taken together as a pattern, which is the only responsible way to assess them, they describe an environment in which deliberate opacity was not an accident of disorganization, but a feature of how the residents functioned. The palace, throughout the entirety of the removal and inventory process, released no statement regarding the contents of Royal Lodge. No inventory was provided to the public or to the press. No acknowledgement was offered of the specialist handling arrangements that multiple sources confirmed had taken place. In the absence of that acknowledgement, the space it leaves is not neutral. Silence, in circumstances as publicly charged as these, does not suspend judgment. It invites it. And what people fill that silence with, drawing on everything they already know, everything that has already been reported, everything that has already been settled and stripped of official titles, is not speculation without basis. It is inference from an established record. The locked room described earlier, the one organized with such deliberate, methodical precision, has not been publicly accounted for. No one has explained its contents. No one has explained the reason for its separation from the rest of the inventory. And that unanswered question, sitting at the center of everything, is not going anywhere. It will be there when the next piece of this story surfaces. And there will be a next piece. Marsh Farm did not receive Andrew as it was. It was prepared, extensively, deliberately, and with a specificity of purpose that extended well beyond the ordinary requirements of making a residential property habitable. In the weeks preceding his arrival, a team of builders worked through the interior with methodical thoroughness, repainting rooms, relaying flooring, reconfiguring the internal layout to accommodate requirements that were never publicly specified. The exterior received equally deliberate attention. The entrance to the property was fitted with substantial wooden security gates, imposing in both scale and design, described by locals who observed their installation not as decorative additions, but as something closer to fortifications. The choice of materials, the height, the manner in which they altered the visual relationship between the property and the public road, all of it communicated permanence and enclosure rather than welcome. Now ask the question that the official framing consistently avoids. What precisely was being prepared? The practical explanation that a residential property requires updating before occupation accounts for some of this. It does not account for all of it. The reconfiguration of interior spaces, in particular, is a detail that warrants examination. Rooms are reconfigured for reasons. Layouts are altered to accommodate specific uses. When a property is being prepared for a private individual with an established residential history and a known set of practical requirements, the decisions made about internal space reflect those requirements. The question of which spaces were enlarged, which were secured, and which were designed with access management in mind is a question that the renovation record, if ever subjected to scrutiny, would answer. What Marsh Farm represents, when viewed without the softening overlay of the farm life retirement narrative, is a property that was purpose-configured to provide its occupant with controlled privacy at industrial scale. The working farm, 500 cattle, organic systems, regular tanker access, machinery and agricultural cycles that create consistent ambient noise and movement, provides a context of routine activity that serves, among other things, as highly effective visual and acoustic cover. Nothing that enters or leaves a working farm attracts the kind of attention that would be triggered by the same movement in a suburban or urban setting. The logistics of agricultural life are opaque to external observation in ways that are immediately useful to someone with a strong interest in limiting that observation. Marsh Farm, in this reading, is not a retirement arrangement. It is a managed placement, and the renovation that preceded Andrew's arrival was not preparation for comfortable living. It was the construction of a specific kind of environment, one designed not for his ease, but for his containment. When the details of the Royal Lodge departure and the Marsh Farm arrival began to circulate, something notable happened, or rather, something notable failed to happen. There was no public sympathy, not even the performative, reflexive variety that often attaches to stories of public figures experiencing visible hardship. There was no curiosity about his welfare, no correspondence column expressions of concern for a man navigating a difficult transition. What there was instead was something considerably colder, and in its coldness, considerably more expressive. In the towns and villages surrounding the Sandringham estate, where proximity to royalty has traditionally carried social cachet, the local response to Andrew's arrival was characterized primarily by the desire not to be associated with it. Shopkeepers who were asked for comment declined. Community representatives offered nothing. The silence of the locals was not the silence of discretion or of traditional deference to royal privacy. It was the silence of people who had made a decision, collectively and without coordination, that they wanted no part of this particular story. Several residents, speaking to journalists who made the journey specifically to capture the community response, were explicit. They did not want the attention. They did not want the association. And they wanted, as one local put it with quiet directness, accountability, a word chosen with care and deployed without elaboration, because none was required. On social media, where the temperature of public feeling registers with unfiltered precision, the tone was equally revealing. Not outrage. Outrage implies surprise, and surprise had long since been exhausted by the accumulated weight of everything that had preceded this moment. What appeared instead was a kind of grim, settled recognition. The sense that what was unfolding was simply the visible surface of a conclusion that had already been reached privately by a very large number of people. For those who had followed the Epstein case, the Giuffre settlement, the stripping of the Duke of York title and military honors, the failed attempt to avoid civil deposition through procedural maneuvering, this was not a new chapter. It was the latest paragraph of a chapter they had been reading for years. The accountability consensus that now surrounds Andrew is remarkable in its composition. It was reached without a criminal trial, without a formal verdict, without a single official statement of guilt or culpability from any institution. It was reached through the accumulated public processing of everything that has been reported, settled, admitted, and stripped away. And it is, in its way, as absolute as any formal judgment. That consensus watched the Royal Lodge story unfold not with fresh interest, but with the steady attention of people who already know how a particular kind of story ends. Strip away the individual details, the rooms, the objects, the gates, the tankers, the silence, and look at the shape of what remains. Look at the architecture of the entire sequence of events, from the first pressure to vacate Royal Lodge to the prepared compound at Marsh Farm, and ask a simple structural question. Does this look like a man exercising choices or a man being managed? The distinction matters enormously, and not merely for reasons of narrative interest. A man exercising choices retains agency. He can be held to his choices in the conventional sense. He can be asked to account for them. A man being managed is, by definition, already subject to a system of accountability that has operated without public visibility and whose terms were not set by him. The management of Andrew, viewed as a continuous process rather than a series of discrete events, suggests the latter arrangement has been in effect for some time. What the Royal Lodge transition made visible, made physically, unmistakably visible, was the moment that management process was required to produce its most overt result. Think about what a home, accumulated over decades, actually is. It is not furniture and walls. It is a three-dimensional record of a life. Every object retained, every piece of correspondence kept, every gift displayed, every room allocated to a specific purpose, all of it reflects choices that were made, relationships that were maintained, and a self-image that was continuously reinforced. Royal Lodge, for all the years Andrew occupied it, was not merely his residence. It was his biography in physical form. And the contents of that biography, now catalogued and dispersed, and in certain cases handled under arrangements that have not been publicly explained, tell a story that he did not intend to share. The royal family's response to the discoveries made during the inventory process is, in its own way, the most telling data point of all. There has been no statement, no distancing, no expression of concern or curiosity from the institution. In a family that has demonstrated, repeatedly and emphatically, its capacity to issue swift and precise public communications when its interests require it, this silence is not passive. It is a posture. It communicates with considerable sophistication that what was found in those rooms is being handled, that the institution is aware, that the institution is managing, and that the institution has decided, for reasons that reflect its own calculus, that public comment would serve no useful purpose. Andrew did not choose Marsh Farm as his retirement home. He was placed there, in a location that serves the requirements of his management as much as his residential needs. What was found in Royal Lodge was not discovered by chance. It was uncovered, the difference between those two words being the difference between accident and inevitability. In a life conducted under the assumption of permanent privacy, within walls that were never expected to be open to external inspection, the accumulation of material that should never have been retained was not carelessness. It was confidence. And it was that confidence, that foundational, decades-long certainty of protection, that the Royal Lodge transition finally and irreversibly exposed. This is the section where precision is required, not atmosphere, not implication specificity. Because the question posed at the beginning of this story was not rhetorical, something does change. Several things change, and the nature of those changes deserves to be examined directly. The first concerns legal exposure, documents and correspondence that have been removed from Royal Lodge under arrangements that deliberately segregated them from ordinary household effects, now exist in a chain of custody that is no longer under Andrew's sole control. Whatever those materials contain, whatever names, dates, financial records, or personal communications they document, they are now accessible in principle to any legal process that establishes sufficient grounds to compel their disclosure. The settlement with Virginia Giuffre extinguished one specific legal venue. It created no general immunity. Ongoing investigations by multiple jurisdictions into the broader network of individuals connected to Jeffrey Epstein have not concluded. The materials removed from Royal Lodge are, in the language of those investigations, potentially relevant. That relevance is not diminished by the manner of their removal. In some interpretations, it is enhanced by it. The second implication concerns the royal family. The institutional distance from Andrew that has been so carefully constructed and maintained since 2019, the removal of titles, the exclusion from public duties, the studied absence of him from official photographs, is not an act of genuine separation. It is a performance of separation, and the discovered contents of Royal Lodge complicate that performance. Whatever was found in those rooms, and whatever decisions were made about how to handle it, was handled by individuals whose interests are inseparable from the institution. The palace's silence is not the silence of an organization with nothing to do with this. It is the silence of an organization that is deeply involved in managing its consequences. The third implication is reputational, and in some respects the most immediate. Andrew's public standing, already at a level that would have been unimaginable to him a decade ago, is now anchored to a physical, material record that cannot be fully suppressed. Objects have been seen, documents have been handled, words have been spoken by workers and specialists who had no particular investment in the outcome. The story of what was found in Royal Lodge has entered the permanent record of his narrative in a way that no future statement, legal action, or institutional rehabilitation effort can fully remove. The fourth implication is perhaps the most structurally important. The palace's room to maneuver is narrowing. The strategy of managed silence, maintaining Andrew at controlled distance while ensuring that no formal accounting was ever required, was effective for as long as there was nothing physically concrete to anchor a different kind of examination. That condition no longer fully holds. What exists now, in the knowledge of workers and specialists and journalists who have been briefed, is a physical correlate to a story that was previously conducted entirely in abstraction. Abstractions can be managed indefinitely. Physical objects and material records have a different relationship with time. Was this discovery an accident, the inevitable result of an institution reclaiming a property from an occupant who had long overstayed his welcome? Or was it the moment when someone inside that institution decided, deliberately and with full awareness of what would be found, that the accommodation had lasted long enough? Return to those workers. Return to the moment of the open door, the pressure of a room holding its breath, the understanding arriving not in a single instant but across a sequence of them, each object seen, each detail registered, each piece falling into place until the full weight of what they were looking at became impossible to ignore or qualify. They hadn't been prepared for this, but in another sense, they had always been going to arrive here. It was the nature of the place, the nature of what it had contained, the nature of a life conducted in the certainty that its walls would hold. The house is more than a house. That much should now be fully apparent. What was inside it was not simply the accumulated belongings of a man moving to smaller premises. It was a record, methodical, physical, resistant to complete erasure, of choices made, relationships maintained, and a posture of permanent unaccountability sustained across decades. The objects are more than objects. The silence surrounding them is more than privacy. Each element carries the full weight of everything that preceded this moment, and that weight does not diminish with the passage of time. It compounds. Strip away every layer of this story and what you are left with is a single, uncomfortable, unambiguous truth. Royal Lodge was not a home being vacated. It was an archive being accessed. The life documented within its rooms was never intended for external reading. The record it contained was never meant to leave on any terms other than those dictated by its occupant. That these conditions no longer hold, that the rooms have been opened, that the contents have been seen, that the handling arrangements have been noted and will be remembered, is not an accident of logistics or an oversight of estate management. It is a rupture, and ruptures of this kind in stories of this weight do not close quietly. What happens next is genuinely open. To the materials now in segregated custody, to the legal frameworks that govern their significance, to the institution managing the distance between itself and the man it can no longer fully protect, to Andrew himself, in the farmhouse surrounded by working land and imposing gates and the daily, sensory reality of a world that has placed him precisely where it intended. The question that lingers, hanging in the air with the same quiet insistence as every unanswered statement in this story, is not whether this was a home being emptied. We know now that it wasn't. The question is what the record it contained will eventually require of those responsible for it. Because if the intention behind all of this was quiet, controlled, and final, it has already, profoundly and irrevocably, failed.